So thank you, Philip, for the introduction. I'm happy to be here today to discuss local news ecosystems and some of what we know about them. My presentation will draw primarily from research that our center has published on news deserts through 2020, but I'm also incorporating some other research and even a really small bit of ad hoc analysis that I've worked on over the past week. My presentation today will cover, we'll cover news ecosystems and approaches to analyzing and mapping local news deserts and the decline of newspapers in the United States. And I do have a very small portion that is specifically about southeastern coastal center states. We do not have data on the any of the territories, but the two specific to SCCHS. Touch on why newspapers are so particularly important. Why is this such a standard in how we measure news ecosystems? Talk about some of the effects of the declines in local news. A lot of what I'll highlight aren't the political aspects of that, but some other things that don't get necessarily as much mention. And then I will conclude by talking about a little bit of the research we will be undertaking as we move forward with this type of research. So really quickly, just to let you know what we do at CISLM, we're an applied research center in the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, and we're focused on growing a more sustainable and equitable future for local news, for journalists, and for communities. And we do this through research, education, and outreach. And so I'm going to begin today by talking about some of the concepts behind research on local news. And I want to start with the concept of the news ecosystem. A news ecosystem is can be thought of as sort of the network of institutions, infrastructure, and networks that provide news information and engagement to communities. So institutions can include news organizations, civic and community organizations, and government agencies. However, in research, we are typically talking specifically about news organizations, and by that, organizations that produce and distribute original reporting. Infrastructure can include things like broadband. It can also include broadband primarily, but also anything necessary to deliver such news and information. And then networks are just how things are connected and whether or not they are interacting with one another. A healthy news ecosystem, you would hope, has interaction of these different elements. However, that is a newer concept in this field, the idea of collaboration instead of competition. Oh, so next I want to talk about news deserts, which is one approach to how we measure local news ecosystems. And this is going to be the bulk of what I talk about today, so I will really briefly touch on it, but we'll get into some very specific elements of news deserts later in the presentation. But the news deserts approach, a news desert rather, is a community with limited access to reliable and trustworthy news and information. And we're talking specifically about information that people need to go about their daily lives, to participate in democratic processes and political processes. And the other approach I will talk about some today is the infrastructure, output, and performance model. And this is actually what most of my research prior to CISLM has used. So I'm much more familiar with it. And it's somewhat complementary to the news deserts approach. This approach considers the infrastructure or news producing and distributing assets within a location. And that can be a state, that can be a county, that could be a city. It could be at any scale you would like. And there is research that borrows elements of all of these and looks at those different levels. Output is basically the quantity of what is produced or distributed. It is, just the sum total of everything that you could find from a particular news producer or set of news producers. And then performance is whether or not the content that is produced is original, and that means produced by that news organization itself rather than republished from a wire or republished from another organization. If it is local, meaning about whatever location you are looking at, and then meets what are known as critical information needs. Now, some research using this model will look just at infrastructure. I have worked on state level analyses of news media infrastructure, and we didn't consider content other than to identify whether or not there was news production happening. And others might just look at the performance to make a determination. And in the News Deserts research I will discuss today, that is actually how we determine whether or not we count something as a news organization. Does this content actually meet a need that people have in terms of information? And so the critical information needs, there are 8 categories, and these came out of a project that the FCC undertook about 10 years ago. It was somewhat controversial and ended a bit early, but one of the things that came out of it was this list of 8 topic categories that individuals need in order to fully participate in civic, social, and political life. And as I mentioned, this is a framework used in a variety of ways, from determining the performance of news content to actually determining whether or not we believe something counts as a news organization. And I would say that in our present era, where we have an increasing amount of misinformation circulating, and we are seeing actually the emergence of some local outlets that do circulate misinformation, being able to use this criteria to identify true news producers is going to be very, very important. And so now we will get into news deserts and the decline of newspapers in the United States. First, I want to talk about how we measure news deserts. I defined it earlier as a place with limited access to news and information. But what that means practically is the presence or absence of a local newspaper. And this can be looked at multiple levels, just like with information output and performance. But the standard tends to be county, or in the case of Alaska, Louisiana, and Virginia, county equivalent. There are some researchers who have taken different approaches. Michelle Ferrier, who was one of the first to dive into this area, mapped media deserts at the zip code level. And more recently, the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State in New Jersey have been taking an approach that looks at the municipal level. And that is to say that different locations it may make sense to, or different places, it may make sense to look at a different level of zoom. Some places county makes more sense, but in others it might be a smaller geographic bound. And a news desert is counted or something counts as a news desert if it has one or no newspapers in it. However, I will say that generally in this field, when we say news desert, we are referring to a county that does not have a newspaper. And when I am speaking of news deserts in this presentation, unless I say otherwise, it will refer to a county with no newspaper. In terms of the counties that have only one newspaper, they're viewed as being at risk of losing their news and therefore are a news desert. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those counties look like in a moment. So on the screen, I have a map that is actually from the Local News Initiative at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. That is where this research has continued. We're going to be taking a different approach here at CISLM, and I have that to discuss at the end. But Penny Abernathy and her team there recently released a report building on the news deserts research that was published here. And as you can see, let me explain the colors before I can say, as you can see, the light green, which probably looks white to all of you, those are counties that do not have a newspaper. The lighter blue are counties with just one, and the dark blue are counties with 2 or more newspapers. And so this came out a couple of months ago. So this is a current picture of local news in the US at the current moment. And we'll talk a little bit about what it represents. Since 2004, approximately 2,500 newspapers have closed in the United States. We have gone from having just south of 9,000 to just over 6,000 just in this, and we're getting close to about a third actually having closed in that period of time. But this has not been felt equally across different types of newspapers. Weekly newspapers have felt the sting quite a bit more than daily newspapers. Weekly newspapers, for one thing, vastly outnumber daily newspapers. So you would expect that they would just in pure numbers lose more. However, a larger proportion of weekly newspapers have shut down in the past 18 or so years than daily newspapers. And as you can see there, see what the makeup of each year's newspapers were like. Today, about 80% of daily newspapers that were around in 2004 are still with us today. However, only 70% of the weeklies that were with us are still around. These declines have been accompanied and driven, in the case of revenue, by some other declines that have been happening with newspapers. First, revenues have declined, which is a driver of all of the trends that we are seeing with the decline of local news. The advertising-focused business model of newspapers has been significantly damaged by the emergence of the web and the ability of people to expand their media diets beyond 1 or 2 sources, typically local newspaper and local television, and unbundle their news. It used to be the case that you could subscribe to a newspaper and you could get a lot of content, a lot of which may not have been necessarily of interest, but it was the place that would have the sports section, which you were most interested in, or comics. Those are the 2 that we tend to talk a lot about, because once they were unbundled, people who just wanted sports had somewhere online to go and find sports news or to find comics without having to actually have news content. And so as a result, the audience for newspapers has declined, and therefore the audience available to advertisers is much smaller than it once was. And so the revenues that newspapers were bringing in before are nothing like they used to be. In addition to this, and in response to this, many papers have reduced their circulation. They produce fewer copies, and they are distributing them in much smaller geographic areas than they were 15 years ago. I actually don't have a circulation map that I can share, but if you look on our website in some of our reports, you can see particularly in Georgia, which will come up a couple of times in this presentation, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has over time drastically reduced its circulation area in the state. And we've seen that with a lot of metro dailies. In addition to circulation declines and revenue losses, we have been seeing declines in publication in terms of frequency in particular, with many daily papers effectively becoming weekly newspapers that publish no more than 3 days per week. And just to explain, in our analysis of newspapers, we define a weekly paper as one that publishes 3 or fewer times a week, and a daily as 4 or more times a week. Additionally, many that have maintained even daily production have cut back on the frequency that they produce print editions. Some just do it on Saturday and Sunday, some just Sunday, some have cut it all together. And in other cases, they've just made them smaller. And then finally, which really wouldn't necessarily be surprising, I think, given all of these factors, but in terms of thinking about news media infrastructure, part of that includes the staff that produce news, reporters and editors, but also the people who run the office and run the business. But we have seen significant staff losses in the newsrooms at U.S. newspapers. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of newsroom workers at U.S. newspapers fell from 71,000 in 2008 to 31,000 in 2020. That is a decline of almost 60%. It is over half. Overall, newsroom employment during this same time period declined about a quarter. So disproportionate staffing losses in newsrooms. I also would note that in the last handful of years, 3 to 4, we've seen increases in the staff at digital news outlets, but nowhere near enough to make up the losses we have seen throughout the industry. So geographically, of course, you saw a map, but the actual numbers that map represented, you can see some of that here. Just about half of the approximately 3,100 counties in the US are classified as a news desert in the broader sense, with roughly 1,600 having only one newspaper and approximately 200 having no newspaper at all. I do want to be careful about how I characterize these counties. Not all of them lost a newspaper. We actually just don't have data going far enough back to know that for sure. Some places have probably always had one paper or not had a newspaper. And in many ways, the decline of local newspapers has highlighted existing shortcomings in who has access to news. However, it is reasonable to assume that many of these counties, particularly the ones that no longer have a newspaper, have lost one. And you can see there, it's been a slight increase over the past 6 years. About 30 more counties, actually exactly 30 more counties now have no newspaper. And of course, talking in terms of how many counties doesn't tell us a whole lot about the people who are actually living there, who are actually experiencing this loss of access to local news. Those 211 counties represent over 4 million people in the US. I actually have not calculated the number for the full 1,800 that are calculated as, or the 1,600 that have only one newspaper, but it's probably, I know it's definitely above 40 million, which was the number in 2020, which is a significant, that's more than 10% of the population. Is it I may be wrong about that, but that's a significant proportion of the population, I will say that. But in addition to the number of people who live there, some things we know about them is they they experience more poverty, they have lower incomes, they are older, and I actually will point out too, they have gotten older since 2020. In the report from 2020, the average median age in News Desert counties, which in this case are those with no newspaper, was 42. And they also have less education on average. So I did some very brief ad hoc analysis of news deserts in southeastern coastal center states that I would like to share. I'm not using necessarily the same metrics that you just saw, but and again, we don't have the territories, but Georgia, there are 35 counties in SCCHS states that do not have a newspaper. Georgia leads with 16, and Georgia is significant also in how we think about news deserts more broadly behind Texas. It has the highest number of counties without a newspaper, and even proportionally has a quite high percentage. There are 159 counties there, so 16 is about 10%. Texas has, I believe it's 22, which is almost 10% of their counties. Granted, that doesn't mean 10% of people, but Florida follows with 6, North Carolina 5, Alabama 3, Mississippi 3 as well, and South Carolina has 2 counties. And that represents just about 675,000. It's actually just a handful more than that. And it is disproportionately, and Black communities in these states are disproportionately affected. The Black population of the counties that are in these 6 states that are news deserts are 33, their population is 30, made up of African-American and Black residents, about a third. And the US population, or 12.4% of the US population is Black or African-American. Forgive me, for some reason I was mingling all of that. So we're looking at about 3 times higher in terms of the Black makeup of the population. So now I want to talk about why newspapers are so particularly important. Why is this the metric we use to determine the health of news ecosystems or to identify news deserts? So first, newspapers tend to lead other media in coverage. They have what we call an agenda setting effect. It tends that newspapers will pick up a story, they will run it, and then other media such as local TV or local radio and digital media to some extent will pick up and cover that as well. And so when you lose a newspaper, you are losing your agenda setter for other media. And so you may lose some coverage of stories as a result. They also produce a disproportionate amount of local news content. I will actually touch on that. I have data behind that, but relative to how much of local news ecosystems they make up, they produce an outsized amount of content. And although, it's all proportional, so if you lose newspapers, you'll just have less content and the proportions will be different. Again, getting back to that agenda setting idea, that means a lot of news just cannot be covered because it won't be known. And they still remain one of the top 3 platforms that US adults use to get local news, primarily through digital sites and apps. but they are still very important for local information. And so this is based on a study, or is from a study I did when I was at the DeWitt Wallace Center at Duke. We had done a content analysis of over 16,000 news stories from 100 randomly sampled communities between 20,000 and 300,000 residents throughout the United States. And what we found, and we categorized the different media outlets. Actually, initially we hadn't done that, so we had to go back into our data and do that. And we found that 25% of our outlets were newspaper, but they were responsible for most of the local news content that we found, both in terms of sheer output and in terms of performance. So this chart here is actually specifically about local news performance, and it is specifically the roughly 1,700, so just over 10% of our sample that were stories which were original, which were local, and which met a critical information need. And newspapers make up about 25% of local news content, but they produce almost 60% of the content that meets all three of those criteria, more than the other three combined. TV and online only outlets, they produce roughly on par with their makeup of local news ecosystems. Radio underperforms slightly. I will flag that we were looking at web stories as a proxy for news content, and so there may be some shifts, but newspapers do seem to have do the lion's share of the work in reporting in local communities in the U.S. And so now I want to touch on some of the effects of the decline in local newspapers. I mentioned that I'm not going to talk significantly about political effects, though there are many. I want to talk about some of the lesser known effects. So one that I think, this morning when I was driving into work, I was like, there's an obvious joke to make about the first one, but the decreased capacity for disease surveillance. Can't imagine that having been relevant anytime recently. But local reporting on instances of disease is a big component of how epidemiologists track the path of disease and where it is spreading. And as newspapers decline, there's less reporting. For example, in the early days of COVID, April 2020, most of the counties that were experiencing significant community transmission were counties that had very limited news capacity. They were one newspaper communities, and so and a lot of those had weekly papers, and that meant there could be a lag in reporting on how many people in the community might have had tested positive for COVID at that point. And so the community therefore would have less notice, but also epidemiologists might have a lag in their ability to know about the presence of the disease. There's also increased air pollution, and this is one of the more interesting ones. Factories and manufacturing plants that are in communities with more newspapers tend to have fewer violations in terms of emissions, also tend overall to let fewer toxins, that might not be quite the right word, into the air. And so in communities where you have fewer newspapers, you actually see more violations and higher levels of air pollution. This one is not a direct effect. And so I will, this next one, but I will talk about it a little bit. We see increased circulation of misinformation in communities without local newspaper. This is largely because local newspapers are a deterrent to polarization. We have seen quite a bit of polarization and extremism in recent years. And that is partly the result of more nationalized media content as people turn to other news sources because they don't have access to their local newspaper anymore, or there just isn't a local newspaper. As a result, we see more nationalized content, which is more polarized in general. And then as people become more polarized, they tend to also consume and share more misinformation. People who live in communities without a local newspaper also tend to have a reduced sense of community. They don't feel as much belonging. They don't know their neighbors as well. And that actually works also in the inverse. When I was at Pew, we actually looked at how people who feel more connected to their community and who know their neighbors tend to consume more news. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg, but there is evidence that it works in the other direction. And then finally, there are fewer competitive elections, specifically at the local level. They're just meaning you may have one candidate always for local offices because people just don't know about them. People tend not to show up to vote in local elections in communities with fewer newspapers as well. And so to conclude, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of current research projects we're doing at CISLM that are related to news ecosystems and news deserts. The first is what we're calling a news census. So I mentioned earlier that this research, the news deserts research specifically, is now continuing at Northwestern. Penny Abernathy is continuing that work there. We're interested in taking a different approach and one that is less focused on the lack of something and more about how do we look at actually what news is available to people. And we're doing it at the county level. First, we're exploring new ways of assessing local news provision, looking not just at the location or presence or absence of a newspaper headquarter or even restricting it just to newspaper. We're actually looking at all of the traditional print, broadcast, and digital, and not prioritizing one over the other. But we're looking at coverage areas, and then we're actually taking those coverage areas and looking at what communities or counties within those coverage areas are actually being reported on. We are wrapping up a phase of this that will hopefully be out later this fall. And we're piloting the method here in North Carolina with the goal of partnering with others to replicate it in other states as well. It is quite an undertaking. We were fortunate to already have data on hand, and I had data as well that I could draw from. But the next phase is going to be expanding the platforms of what we include in our concept of local news, and including newsletters, podcasts, Facebook pages and groups, as well as influencers. And if anyone has experience researching influencers, I would be very happy to discuss that because it is very new to me. But we're really excited about that and what we might learn about local news in our state, and hopefully set up a new way for people to understand. And then we are wrapping up a diversity audit of our newsrooms here in the state. Again, going back to the concept of news infrastructure, not just being the institutions and being news organizations, but being the people who work there. We are collecting demographic data on our newsrooms, surveying both organizations and individuals, with the goal of supporting newsrooms in collecting and tracking demographic data. We are in the process of analyzing the data. Currently, we got it back this week, and we're really looking forward to that as well. And so finally, if you are interested in learning more, our website is sizzlin.org, and my email is jamahone@unc.edu. So stop my share.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mahone. Great presentation. Very eye-opening for me personally in a lot of different ways. So at this point, I want to open it up for questions and comments. Once again, we'll use the chat or the Q&A, whichever one you're more comfortable with. I'm monitoring both of them. We do have one question already, and so we'll go ahead and start with that one. Dr. Lisa Lundy said, very interesting presentation, Dr. Mahone. Do you see any other sources filling the gaps for local news?
Yes, so thank you. And there are some. I think the big challenge is, and I will get to that, I will say one of the biggest challenges is figuring out the model for paying for it. But we are seeing the growth of digital news sites. Unfortunately, they're kind of at a standstill, but we're seeing those emerge more and more. So that's one option, is having digital startups that can cover local news. The other is the emergence of some programs that are aimed at actually helping sustain the media we do have. And we have a program here at Sizzlin called Table Stakes. It's actually through the Knight Foundation, and we're just one organization that does it. I shouldn't say it's ours. But the whole idea is helping newsrooms rethink audience strategy, rethink sustainability, so that they are targeting their reporting to help communities and developing ways to sustain their revenue without relying on advertising. So there's also some organizations that are training citizens who aren't journalists necessarily to cover things like City Hall, or go to county commission meetings. There's some that are training them to analyze data and to basically be community journalists. And so that's one way. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in this field is how we actually think about how we're going to continue to have local news. And we focus a lot on the reporting capacity, and that is a very, very important component. But we need to focus also on helping newsrooms and people who have digital startups think about it as a business as well, so that they're able to generate revenue and not end up in a situation where they can do some reporting, but they can't maintain payroll, for example, or that a lot of founders actually don't pay themselves salaries, and you would not like that. So those are some of the options. Oh, thank you.
All right, we have another question from Timothy. How would you rate the accuracy or bias in newspaper versus online sources? Are papers in monopoly more likely to be extreme or centrist?
So I can't speak very specifically to that. I can talk about some things I've observed and that I know are happening. But I actually don't know necessarily paper versus online. I think as a whole, online presents more opportunities for people to spread misinformation as far as going to accuracy. In terms of bias, I think that might be easier. Part of why I didn't touch on this, but local news is generally more trusted. And we believe part of why is because those are people who are more familiar to those communities. But I don't know necessarily that means they're less biased necessarily. So I actually have never done research that actually looks at that specifically. I can mention, however, because I did research on it, we are seeing the emergence of some more partisan and in some cases misinformation generating local news content. There's the what we call pink slime, which are they're called pink slime because they generate content supposedly through AI and with limited reporting staffs. And when they have reporting staffs, they're not based where they're reporting. And they tend to have very partisan content. They're also now in some places publishing print copies, which is a very fascinating thing because I think their whole model was like, we can do this quickly online and just spread stuff. But now they're finding value to print copies. But also in the course of working on the news census, we've come across a number of sites that seem to have been not particularly partisan or extremist and have gone that way. And we're not quite sure. We're saving that for other research and I have a lot of interest in that. But I don't know if papers in monopoly are more likely to be extreme or centrist. I can't really speak to that. I think, but I think online does make it easier to circulate that kind of content. The online environment, I should say. Online is not the right way to say that. So, so that's the most I can say on that. Sorry, there was a lot of rambling to not answer a question.
Yeah, if you have any other questions or comments, you can put those in the chat or the Q&A. One question I had, Dr. Mahone, is, so you said towards the beginning that, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, newspapers tend to be agenda setting and news kind of starts there and then other sources might pick it up. Once again, correct me if I got that wrong, but if newspapers are in decline, what's become kind of the agenda setting source, and has it moved more national? I mean, I know when I open my phone, it's typically national and international news that I'm seeing. So yeah, what's the landscape there?
So I will say this is something I should know a lot more specifically than I do. I think digital in communities that have a digital site, that probably does some of that work, of the agenda setting work. Social media is increasingly becoming a way that that news organizations pick up on stories. Somebody may tweet about something they've experienced. I think we've all at this point, if you're on, I try not to be as active on Twitter as I am, but if you're very on Twitter, you've definitely seen where somebody has tweeted a video of something and a news organization, multiple, will swoop in and ask to use it. Sometimes it's a story that's in progress, but it helps them build their story. So social media can have that impact as well. But actually, I mean, to be honest, I don't know entirely that there is one clear agenda setter. And I will say, I suspect newspaper is less of one, not just because of the decline, but there's just so many places you can go now. So it would be odd to me that it would be, but I do think newspapers can pick up on things a little bit quicker. So. Any other questions?
Just one quick thing. I know you said that you're hoping to have that report come out later this fall and that others could contact you. But if people wanted to stay up to date with CISLM or anything, how would you recommend people seeing your research, and would just be going to your website? What do you recommend there?
I would say definitely go to the website, and you can, so there are a couple of ways. Obviously, that'll probably be when we publish something on the front page, but we do have a research and analysis portion of our site. We have past research that includes the News Deserts research that I discussed, which, as I mentioned, is continuing elsewhere. But we do have all of that, and you can request access to that database if you're interested in using it. We also have a recent report we did on the unionization of local newsrooms, and we have some other research, and that would be the place to go to find everything we have published. Also, if you wanted to follow me on Twitter or follow Sizzlem on Twitter, actually, I'll start with Sizzlem. They're a little bit better at tweeting our content. It's Sizzlem at UNC. I would say all caps, but I don't think it matters on Twitter, but that's how we have it stylized. And then I'm Jess A. Mahone, because Jess Mahone is taken as well. So yeah, that's usually how we share. And then also you can look at the Hussman website, and when we have releases, they tend to help us promote those as well.
Excellent.
So we have two. The diversity audit report will come out. That's in partnership with Elon University, also here in North Carolina, which is why it's restricted, because they are specifically a North Carolina-based organization, and that'll be probably coming up in about a month or so. And then, the new first phase of new census will be closer to the end of the year, but it'll be sooner than it seems to me right now.
Wonderful. And I'll include some of these links that you just mentioned in the follow-up email that goes out to all of the registrants for this webinar. So if you're on, I'll be sure to have some of that information there as well, along with today's recording.
Great.
Any other questions before we close out? I will say we don't have another webinar scheduled currently for SCC AHS. We're not doing one next month, but we will likely have one in November. So of course you can stay tuned by going to sccahs.org. You can reach out to me at any time. My contact information is there. But yeah, I don't see any other question. Oh, and the other thing is there will be an evaluation that will automatically load as you exit today. And we appreciate your time taking that. Should just take a few minutes to do that. Well, Dr. Mahone, are there any last words or comments you want to say before we close out today's webinar?
Thank you for this opportunity. I would encourage people, if you have a local paper in your community, look into supporting them in some way. I don't want to try to make people pay and get a subscription, but that would be very useful there. And also, if there's a digital site to support them, however you can. I think local media are so critical to all of our lives, and I just love to see people supporting them in any way they can.